He came down to earth from heaven, who is Lord and God of all. My last presentation was about how religion began through what were called the noumenal powers. That idea that somehow ancient people began to see the numinous as spirits around us that were responsible for things like food and the weather, and made the difference between life and death to ancient peoples. But my presentation today is about how that changed and gods became thought of as like humans and taking on human characteristics. I'd like to make the screen go wavy a minute, and let's go back in time, 3000 BC, and we find ourselves in ancient Mesopotamia, in the land that we call Sumeria, the Sumerian Empire. And there people begin for the first time to form towns and cities. Groups of perhaps 30 to 40,000 people. Up to this point, remember, they'd just been simple farmers living out in the countryside around them. But they make the decision to gather together. Gathering together, of course, gives you strength within the group. It allows you to trade, to build up money and issues like that. But for 30 and 40,000 people to live together, you need some form of ruler, some form of leadership. And we would give the name to that a king or some sort of monarch. Now, these rulers, often taking power because of their military might, are given a quality that we would call majesty. Majesty, which sort of means greatness. And in order to maximize their greatness, they take on those noumenal powers that had existed before. And so these humans are now gods. And as we talk about pharaohs in ancient Egypt, or as we talk about kings in ancient Mesopotamia, we are talking about gods. And that's what obviously leads, and you can see the way that this develops, into an understanding of gods living outside of the earth, but having human-like qualities. And very often in ancient stories, they will take on and combat the ancient noumenal powers. In the Greek myth, for example, you read about figures like Zeus and the Olympian gods taking on the Titans and the other ancient noumenal forces. So these human-like gods are things that justify and give authority to human rulers. There's no rocket science here. Clearly, if I want to rule my country efficiently, the more authority I can gain, the better. And this leads to a whole creation of a temple culture, the idea that people, in order to prosper and do well, will want to get that God on their side. And when that God is living in the palace down the road, that in a sense makes it even easier. Now, there's a problem here, isn't there? Because these human kings die. Now, clearly those are noumenal forces, those forces of nature, those forces of the wind, of the water, they don't die. But the human gods do die. So very early on, you get this situation where these anthropomorphic gods, these human gods, take on what we would call a death and resurrection myth. And the idea of a God dying and coming back to life, of course, at Christmas is a very important one. But we'll come back to Jesus. This presentation isn't about Jesus. We'll come to him later. But Perhaps one of the most important of those death and resurrection stories is the story of Isis and Osiris. And it's a very interesting one and gives a good insight into what we're talking about here. Because Isis and Osiris take on Set. Set is the numinal force, the force of the desert, the force of somehow dark forces there. And Seth lives out in the desert and he kills Osiris. But Isis, in a sense, brings him back to life enough that a child, Horus, is able to be born from the union of Isis and Osiris. So you've got a god who dies, Osiris, and a god who then rises anew, Horus, and that's death and resurrection motif explains why you've got a new pharaoh in town. So death, resurrection, gods living, dying, being reborn. Hope you liked that. If you did, click on like the video, subscribe to the channel. Crikey, that one overran a little bit. Have a great Christmas. See you for the next presentation and take care.